Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is a re-record of video 5, which was on making API calls. The reason is I forgot to turn on the headset the first time I recorded this. So I'm going to be making a new branch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to the video 4 branch so we can start up after what I left off in video 4. See the nice thing about branching. So I'm going to do git checkout video 4. Okay, and then I'm going to do git checkout. Let me just close all this. Git checkout -b video 5 take 2. Okay, so new branch. So that's the branch you'll see when you see the ending of this video. If you're curious, I'm going to be trying to do the exact same thing as I did previously, but if you want to see the code left over from the failed take, the original video 5 branch will get you there. Okay, so let's start basically what I want to talk about now is making an API call, okay? And this is going to require us to learn a few new things that we haven't talked about up to this point, which is the useEffect hook, using the map array method to map over elements in JSX, yeah, just using like fetch or something like that. And again, it doesn't really matter. There isn't a way of making an API call in React. It's agnostic to how you make the actual call. So if you want to use fetch, you want to use Axios, you want to use some other HTTP client library in JavaScript, you're more than welcome to do so. Again, there's a lot of really awesome supplemental libraries that are built just for React, like React Query and React, I think useFetch or React Fetch, that are really good. I know, along with my own library, Merced React Hooks, that have a lot of really good utilities for doing these things. What matters is what you do with the data once you receive it from the API call. Okay, so typically without a framework, what you're doing is you get the data from the API call and you just immediately like render it to the DOM. So you say, hey, I got this array of data from an API. Let me go create this node and change the inner text of the node, and let me just do that for each item in the array. What happens here is that there's an intermediate step, because what you want is the component to re-render, because the API call doesn't happen right away or doesn't finish right away. So always on the initial render of any component, the data just doesn't exist yet. So essentially the way you make sure that the component updates when the data arrives is that you want that data to go to state. So that way when you update the state with the API data, the component will then re-render. So that's essentially like the thought process here. Okay, so this data you're getting from any kind of API through any kind of external request is you're always gonna want to store in state, because again, you're not gonna have that data right away. So you want to make sure you trigger a state change to re-render the component when the data arrives. So we'll show you an example of this. So I'm going to create a new component, and we're going to call this API data.js. Okay, and we'll just create the function. So function API data, and we're going to define props. Probably won't be using props, but once you know that what props are, it's good to always just kind of have that available. Okay, and then return API data, just to show that it's on the screen. And then of course we need to export default the component. And there you go. Okay, so we have a component created. It doesn't really do much other than render an H1, but we have a component. So now I'll go back into app.js. I'm going to go import the component. Import API data. There we go. And then I'll just replace this counter component with the API data component. Okay, so there we go. So technically that's all set up. npm run start. Okay, so that's starting everything up. And again, that's literally all the component does right now. So I'm going to open up DevTools so we can kind of see these as we go. So again, React DevTools is a Chrome extension you can install. So I go to components, I see there's the API data component, and there's really nothing in there. There's really no props, no state. You see nothing in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import things that I'm going to need. So I'm going to need to import useState, because we're going to store the API data result in state. We're going to import useEffect. We'll get into what useEffect is in a little bit. Okay, and again, these are hooks. Anytime you see that word use in front of the name of a function that's either built into React or from a third-party library for React, these are referred to as hooks. And hooks The main thing about hooks is that they have to be used inside the actual component. Again, I can't use them outside the component. They have to be used in the component. Okay, so there has to be somewhere used inside these curly brackets right here. Okay, so essentially what I want to do is you generally always want to create state to hold your API data. So first thing you always want to do is really know what data you're working with. So what I'm going to be doing is that I have a site here, dummydata.netlify.app, that just serves some JSON files for some like practice. So I'm going to be using this Pokemon data. So I'm going to click on Pokedex here so you can see the data. And the first thing you really want to do is like take a look at the data, because that's going to help you figure out what the original, like what should be the starting state. So really what I want to store in my state is this array of Pokemon. Okay, so that's really what I want. So since what I'm going to have in there is an array, then technically this initial value should be an empty array. Okay, so that way it's consistent. It's an array before and after. So I'm going to create some new state. So const, again, Pokemon will be the name of the state, and then set Pokemon will be the set function, set Pokemon, and that's going to equal use state, and then the initial value is going to be just an empty array. So that'll be the initial value of this state. Okay. Cool. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to actually have a function that makes the API call, okay, and then updates the state. Okay, the reason you want to wrap it in a function is just so that way it's nice and encapsulated. And on top of it, if you need to make the calls from other places, you can, because maybe people want to update the list of Pokemon, so you can attach the function to a button. Bottom line is all this function does is make, whenever it's called, makes the API call, updates the state with the data from the API. So const, I usually will use a get prefix, so get Pokemon. Okay, equals, no arguments are needed. And the first thing we want to do, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this an async function, so that way I can use the async await syntax. If you're not familiar with async await, I recommend watching my asynchronous JavaScript videos. Just look up Alex Merced asynchronous JavaScript. I have a series of videos where I really kind of get into detail about promises and using async await. But essentially the basic idea is this. The async keyword tells JavaScript that this function is an asynchronous function, which generally does two things. It allows me to use the await keyword in the function, and it makes it that whatever this function returns gets wrapped in a promise. Okay, so this function will always return a promise. Even if I return something else, that thing will end up being wrapped in a promise, because it has to enable that await functionality. Now, of course, this is not necessarily so necessary in the newest versions of Node, but I'm not going to assume you're using the newest versions of Node, because now they have like top level await. But I'm not going to worry about that now. I'm going to show the tried and true way that'll work regardless. And again, you don't have to use fetch. I'm going to be using fetch, which is the way to make API calls that's built into the browser. Because again, React is front-end code, so it runs in the browser, which means I can use the fetch API. Okay. Eventually, I think now they're probably actually going to add fetch to Node soon, but not quite there yet. Okay. So, but you can also use Axios, use whatever library you'd like. But essentially what I'm going to do now is make the request. So again, when I get that request, what I'm going to get back is the response to the request. I'm going to create a variable called response. And inside the response, I want to await. So await means pause the function until this promise is complete. So the function that happens, whatever happens right after the await, should resolve to a promise. So in this case, fetch, which we know fetch always returns a promise, because that's how fetch works. And then here I'll put the URL. So I'm going to say, hey, you know what? This is the URL where the data that I want to get is. Okay, so there's the URL. And fetch by default makes a get request to the URL. So that's making a get request to this URL, which should receive that JSON data. Okay, and again, because we're using the await keyword, instead of receiving a promise, I'm receiving the result of the promise. Okay, but then the way fetch works, if you've used fetch before, hopefully you've used fetch by now, what fetch does is that it's going to not return the actual data, but it returns a response object. And the response object can then be converted into either like a text, a JavaScript object, using different methods that are on it. Okay, so what I really want is to take the JSON response and turn it into a JavaScript object. So to do that, I need to take the response and use the JSON method that's built into it. That converts that JSON data and turns it back into a JavaScript object, which then gets saved in this variable called JSON. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to update the state. I got the data from the API call. So now I want to set Pokemon to the new value. But I don't want to set it to just JSON. The reason being is that JSON, if I look at and again, this is why it's important to take a moment and look at what you're getting in the browser, like look at your data first. Technically, the API is giving me an object. So you see this little curly bracket right over here? So technically, I'm getting an object back. The array that I want is a property of that object. It's a property called Pokemon. And see, the value of that property is this array. So really, that's what I want to set my state to. So really, I want to set it to JSON.Pokemon. Okay, how did I know that? I looked at the data. There's no shortcuts to that. You have to understand the API you're working with and the data that it sends back. You just have to take the time to like look at it, assess it, think about it. But that's it. So again, we're just making the API call, taking the response and turning it into a JavaScript object, and then assigning the part of that object that we want to state, and that's that. Now the thing is that I could put a button in there and say, hey, get Pokemon, and you click the button, and then the Pokemon arrive. Like, let's actually do that so you can see that. So let's set up a few pieces in place first. So what's gonna happen? I may not always have the data, right? Okay, because that API call happens after the first render because that code's running as it's rendering. So that means that, again, that state's going to start off as this empty array. So something you always have to keep in mind is you have to always plan for that situation because that situation will always be true. Always on the first render, whatever the initial value is, that's what you have. Okay. So in that case, if I try to render all this Pokemon data, I might get errors. Because the data doesn't exist yet. So generally what you would like to do is you want to create like an if statement or some sort of way to catch that. The easiest way to do it is just to create an if statement and say, hey, if in this case, if Pokemon dot length, because it's an array, the length is less than or equals than 0, so long as the array is empty, then we're just going to return h1, there is no Pokemon. Okay. And actually, let me wrap that in a fragment. Okay, and then in this, we'll also have a button that says get Pokemon. And when you click this button, because again, whenever you do like on click equals, and then you just attach the function, we'll say get Pokemon. That'll run this get Pokemon function. Okay, now again, if the length of Pokemon is greater than 0, which means we've already received the Pokemon, I don't want to return this. I want to render something else. I want to render the Pokemon. So this return statement will do that. Because again, a function in JavaScript can only return one thing. It can only return once. And the minute it returns, it's done. So if this if is true, like if this if happens, this will never happen. This line will just not happen. Anything after this return will stop. Okay. So in this case, I want to put the scenario where this doesn't happen. So again, if you actually have Pokemon in the array. So in this case, in this array, what I want to do is I'll create a div, and we'll give it a class name of Pokemon, just in case we want to style it. But in this, I may want to create another div for each Pokemon. I don't know how many Pokemon are in the array. I mean, I know it's 150, but what if it's some other number? Okay, so what you do is if you want to create like JSX for each element in an array, this doesn't matter with API calls. It just if you have an array of data, this is what you do. So if you have an array of data, which Pokemon is supposed to be an array of data, and I want to generate some JSX for each thing in the array, because I want the exact same div for each Pokemon, I'll use the map method. Because what map does, it allows you to pass each item in an array to a function and create a new array made up of the return values of that function. If you're not that familiar with the map method, which is super important in React, I highly recommend watching my React map video. There's a video, just look up Alex Merced React map and you'll find it. Or look at my array method videos or my array master class where I go really in depth with it. It's a super, super powerful function that you really want to master. That's built into JavaScript, built into arrays. Okay, so this is not necessarily that's the thing about React. React gives you some tools, but it really lets you lean on your existing JavaScript skills instead of trying to give you too many things to do things for you, which I like. So basically, the better you are at JavaScript, the better you'll be at React. Okay, but essentially the way it works is that you get this function. Basically, you pass map this function, and then here I have to declare an argument or a parameter for the things in the array. So essentially, each thing in the array is a single Pokemon. Okay, I mean Pokemon is singular and plural, so I can't really use that word again. So I'm going to use the word Poke to represent a single Pokemon. Okay, and then what I can do is it's just a function, so I could, and then all that matters is that I return JSX. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to return a div. Okay, again, because JSX has to have only one parent element. Now the key thing here, when you're mapping, React wants you to put in a key prop. Okay, key prop. And the reason why that's important is because the underlying React engine uses that key prop to make sure it's not re-rendering the same elements again and again. So this helps you optimize how React does its like reconciliation between renders. Okay, which will allow you to have a faster app. So you can, the app will work without it, but it'll warn you like this is not going to work optimally. So generally you want it to be something unique. So I'm going to go take a look at my data, and I take a look at each Pokemon, and each Pokemon has an ID number. That should be unique for each Pokemon. So I'm going to use that. So I'm going to say poke.id. There you go. So it's happy. Okay, and then for each Pokemon, I'm going to want their name, h1. So it can be like poke.name. And again, how do I know it's poke.name? I look at the data. Because again, it's looping through this array. So poke is always going to equal this object for one Pokemon. So like the first time it loops, this is Poke, then the second time it's Ivysaur, and so forth. This is why it's important to sit there and take a look and be comfortable reading JSON data to kind of understand like, okay, how is the data structured? Okay, and the other thing is, see, we have this property here, image, that has the URL to a picture of the Pokemon. So I want to use that. So I'm going to create an image tag. And again, image tags, you use a source property. So then I will pass poke.image as thing there, and then again you need to have an alt tag for your images, so we'll just use the poke.name there as well, and that should be good. Okay, so now if I go back to the React app, I see there is no Pokemon currently. Okay, now if I click this button, because again we attach that function, the get Pokemon function, to this button, if I click it, see it makes the API call. Oh, it looks like it errored, so let me see why. Cannot read properties of undefined reading length. Okay. Set Pokemon. Let's see. Let's take a look at what happened there. There should be small errors. The above error occurred in component. Cannot read properties of undefined reading length. So that means at some point it did not become an array. Double. So somewhere I made a mistake here. Response.json. Oh, I forgot the word. Here's why. See here? I need the word await, because technically the response is also going to be this response.json function returns a promise. So that's where I made a mistake. So essentially what happens is that this was a promise object, and I set the promise object to the to state, and the result is there was no length property. So that's where you're getting that whole like no can't find length of undefined. So let's try that again. I'll refresh the page. I click get Pokemon, it makes the API call, and Pokemon appear. Okay, so cool, neat. Now, what if I want to have the Pokemon get called right away? This is where useEffect comes into play, because there's no way for me to really express something that I want to happen right away. Because you're thinking, maybe I could just write get Pokemon, like right here. The problem is I would create an infinite loop, because the function would run, it would call get Pokemon, which would make the API call, update the state, which causes the function to re-render, which means that function runs again, calls get Pokemon again, updates the state again, which causes another re-render, and this just kind of goes forth, so forth, and so forth, and you create this infinite loop. So to avoid that, there's a hook called useEffect, which we loaded up earlier. Okay, so the useEffect hook, what it does is that it takes two arguments. It takes a function, and it takes an array. So I always just set it up like this before I do anything else. Okay. Okay, I see. It's complaining that it's called conditionally. Like so you see this error here because this is actually a good example. So when it says useEffect is called conditionally, the reason is because this line of the code will not run if this if statement runs. So technically, this use effect will never happen in certain situations. You never want your hooks to be within conditional logic, okay? Because the way React works under the hood is that all these hooks, they're being tracked in a certain order. So they need to execute in the same order every time the component re-renders. So that means I need to move this use effect outside of this part of my code. Because again, it's below that if statement, which makes it conditional. There. I see. So let's take the use effect. Let's cut it out and then move it above the if statement. So that way it'll always happen. And see, now it's happy. So that's an important lesson. Remember, no conditional hooks. Like you can't say, hey, create state, only this happens. You always create the state. You always have the use effect. And because they have to always occur in the same order. Usually that's not much of a problem. Okay, usually it's a pretty easy limitation to deal with. Okay, but essentially what happens, the way useEffect works, is that when the component loads, this function will run. Whatever this function does, it'll run. The function will not repeat on subsequent renders. So every time the state updates and the component re-renders, this function will not run again. So you don't create that infinite loop. The only time it will run again is if some value in this array changes. So, if there's some particular variable that might change, but doesn't always change. But if it does change, I want to run that function again. Like, oftentimes maybe you need to calculate a value or something. Then you do, you would put that here in this dependency array. Most of the time, you just need something to happen when the component loads. So this formula here, just an empty array with the function first, works. So essentially, all I really want to happen here is that whenever the page first loads, I want this to call the get Pokemon function. And I never need this to happen again. Okay, so if I go over here now, if I refresh the page, I'll hold shift and refresh. See, it says there's no Pokemon. There is no Pokemon, shows up for like 1 second. The reason being is, again, the first render will never have the data. So just remember that. The very first time the component renders, the data doesn't exist yet because the API call hasn't completed yet. So in that case, that's why I had to have that if statement. But otherwise, like you see, but it happens pretty quickly. Like you barely notice it. So if I'll do it again, you barely see like there is no Pokemon there for like a brief moment. But then there's all the Pokemon coming from the API data. Okay, and then that's generally like how you can handle working with API data. So again, generally you're going to want to always store the result of the API in state, of the API call in state. How you make the API call is up to you. You can use Axios, you can fetch, you can use React Query, you can use React Fetch. Any of these libraries and tools are fine. The only thing that matters is that once the API call is complete is that it gets saved in state. Now, if you're using React libraries like React Query, it can handle a lot of that for you. There's a little conceptual overhead up front, but it can save you a lot of time because it also handles things like caching and making it available to other parts of your app. It's a pretty sweet library. I do have videos on it. Just look up Alex Merced React Query. Again, useEffect allows me to do things when the component first loads. So again, it's always like the function, what it does when it first loads, and then when to repeat the function. You could also do, if this function returns another function, the function that it returns will be run whenever the component is removed from the screen. Just something you probably won't need too often. The only reason you would ever really need that is if like you were doing some working outside of the React workflow. So like what happens sometimes is that people might attach an event listener to the window object. But React won't know to remove that. So then you use the remove part of the useEffect to remove that listener whenever that component leaves the screen. But again, 90% of the time you won't have to worry about that. So again, this function will run the first time and anytime anything in this array updates. But you always need both arguments. If you just leave this, if you forget this array, it'll cause an infinite loop. Okay, so always make sure you set up both arguments in the useEffect. Again, as a reminder, whenever you're going through an array of items in your JSX, you have an array of things you want to show up in your JavaScript, the map method is the key. Okay, that's going to allow you to create this JSX for each Pokemon in the array. That works for whatever, like if I have a bunch of students in an array or a bunch of animals in an array, I can use map to create the JSX for each in the visual without having to write it like 150 times. Okay, and then that's generally the basic idea of how to work with APIs in React. Okay, now again, I don't have to do all this in one component. I could just make the API call in this component and then pass that data as props to another component and let that other component handle the actual visual. And that's actually a distinction a lot of people will do. What they'll do is they'll separate their stateful components, and they'll have components that just are there to manage state, so they don't actually have a visual. Instead, what they'll do is they'll just pass the state to props as other components, which handle the visual and are stateless. So essentially, like, the state's managed by the parent component, and then that way, like, the child component can be used in different places, so you can have the same display, even if different stateful components are passing them different states. So that's a little bit more advanced, but you can start thinking about like the way you make things. Like, I have a lot of other videos on React. Just look up Alex Merced React, and you'll find plenty of other videos and a lot of techniques. But this will cap off this series. This should give you a good foundation on the basics of working with React. And aside from that, it's just a normal HTML, CSS, JavaScript that you're used to if you've been building websites and web applications. If you haven't been doing that stuff and you're not that familiar with HTML and CSS, then you need to go watch my other videos on HTML, CSS. Because again, this is just showing you sort of the ins and outs of just working with React and how React works. You still need to have that foundational web development knowledge to really take that to the next level. So otherwise, my name is Alex Merced. If you like the video, like the description, like the video, subscribe. Go check out my blog over there at alexmercedcoder.com, and have a great day and enjoy.